Chancy and the Grand Rascal. 10. The Ostrich and the Snapping Turtle. Chancy pulled his straw hat resolutely over his eyes and picked up a stone. It wouldn't surprise him if Colonel Plug jumped out of the cane brake at them. That man was infernally cunning. Uncle Will led the way along a narrow road, and Chancy kept his eyes peeled. Before long, they came to a ramshackle molasses mill abuzz with flies. There was no sign of Colonel Plug or anyone else. The sorghum was not yet ripe enough to harvest. Yet here and there a stalk was turning yellow, with seed clusters rising at the top. Chancy fed seeds to Calamity, and he and Uncle Will chewed out the cane juice while tramping further upriver. It was all the breakfast they could find. "He might have pitched the squirrel gun in the river," Chancy said dismally. "My axe, too." "Oh, he's ornery enough," Uncle Will nodded. "But they are worth cash money. He has in mind to sell them." They walked a little farther, and Chancy said, "It's not likely he met anyone in the dark who would buy that plunder." "Not likely at all." Chancy felt reassured. It was still early morning, and if they hurried, they might catch the rascal asleep, as Uncle Will had said. They hardly met a soul along the river, but when they did, they stopped briefly to describe Colonel Plug and the squirrel gun, and the axe with the fine black cherry handle. If the scoundrel had come this way, he hadn't been observed. Uncle Will lengthened his stride, and Chancy had to step lively to keep up. At noon, they stood looking at Shawneetown across the river. Chancy could see 3 or 4 hotels, and he almost fancied he could hear Colonel Plug snoring in one of them. They had to wait for the ferry, but once on the Illinois side of the river, they made a beeline for the best hotel. Then they tried the second best and the third best, and on to the worst, until there were no hotels left in town to search. It was clear that Colonel Plug was not to be found in Shawneetown. Passing only long enough to bolt a meal of fried catfish, Chancy and Uncle Will continued upriver. It was a hot, dusty march, and Chancy would be glad to see the sun go down. Calamity rode his shoulder in the shade of his straw hat. They reached Uniontown late in the night. No man answering Colonel Plug's description had been seen, and Chancy's hopes faded. But Uncle Will remained the soul of optimism. "By Ginger," he laughed, "it looks like we got him captured." "Captured?" said Chancy. "That humbug went down river, that's plain now. It wouldn't surprise me if Captain Harp and the boys have already pounced on him." Chancy touched the lump the Buckeye made on in his hip pocket. He had been disgusted with it all day. It seemed to him the most temperamental Buckeye ever grown. If it was supposed to bring good luck, how had Colonel Plug managed to make off with his pa's axe? But finally, Chancy dug out the Buckeye and began to polish it. He'd give it another chance. "I don't see any reason why we shouldn't have ourselves a steamboat ride," said Uncle Will, "unless you'd rather walk to Paducah." "No, sir," said Chancy. "I'd like a steamboat ride." Torches lit up the steamboat landing. Yellow flames glittered from black iron baskets hung on poles. The night air was scented with burning pine chips and resin. They looked over an ancient side-wheeler due to leave in the morning with a deck cargo of onions. Her narrow decks were warped, her paint was peeling, and her woodwork was pocked with bullet holes. She was the Snapping Turtle. They learned from the roustabouts that she had been shot up during the war, sunk, refloated, and had more lives than a cat. "How does she take your eye?" Uncle Will asked. "By dogs, I never saw a steamboat that I liked better," Chancy answered. That was a monstrous exaggeration, but the Snapping Turtle would get them to Paducah the following afternoon, and Chancy didn't intend to be particular. "Let's hunt up the mud clerk and get ourselves a cabin," Uncle Will said. They found the purser, a long-haired riverman with his feet propped up on his desk. "A cabin for 2, said Uncle Will. Over the tops of his sweaty glasses, the purser looked doubtfully at the bird perched on Chancy's shoulder. "Excuse me, gents," he said, "but do you mean to bring that chicken along?" "We don't mean to leave it behind," said Uncle Will. "Well, sir, then you'll have to go deck passage. We don't allow chickens in the cabins." Uncle Will shoved back his hat. "Of course you don't. But that bird ain't a chicken," he said. "You're not the first to make that mistake. No, sir. So we'll be obliged if you would point us to our cabin." The purser's glasses slid lower on his nose. "If that ain't a chicken, what do you call it, sir?" Uncle Will shook his head. "I was hoping you wouldn't ask that. I'm not anxious for word to get around. Folks would pester us half to death." "I won't tell a soul," said the mud clerk. Uncle Will hesitated, then he bent closer and lowered his voice. He was straight-faced as a deacon. "I don't expect you to believe this, sir, but that bird happens to be an ostrich. Full-grown, too." The purser's jowls sagged. Chancy's eyebrows lifted. The thought took his breath away. It was a wonder to him how Uncle Will could stretch a young chicken into a full-grown ostrich. It was a wonder to the purser as well, but he was quick to recover from the surprise. He licked his lips and rose to the occasion with a relish. The duel of wits was on. "Ain't that bird kind of small for an ostrich?" he said. "No, sir," Uncle Will replied. "It's not generally known, but ostriches never get any bigger than that. I was surprised as you are to learn that." "Glory," said the purser. "You expect me to swallow that, sir?" "I was hoping you would," Uncle Will grinned, "but I may have been departing slightly from the facts. I'll admit that. The bona fide rock-bottom guaranteed facts are so hard to believe, you'd think I was trying to string up a bunch of nonsense." "Not for a moment," protested the bursar. "I can see you're a man who pays close attention to the truth, and I don't intend to settle for anything else." Chancy never saw two more sober faces. It was as if the merest glimmer of a smile would break the rules and ruin the contest, with the cabin at stake. "Well, sir," said Uncle Will, "there's a thing or two you'll have to know about ostriches. Where they come from, it don't rain more than once every couple of 100 years. They can't take water. When an ostrich keels over in the heat, you don't want to throw a bucket of water to revive the poor devil. You throw dust. That's what they're used to. But we didn't know that, and last summer in Kansas, just north of Wichita, that bird you're looking at keeled over in the sun. We did the same thing I reckon you'd have done. Threw a bucket of water at it?" "Exactly." "And what happened?" "Why, sir, the ostrich shrunk." The purser's jaw dropped. "Glory," he breathed. "I wouldn't believe it myself," said Uncle Will, straightening, "if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes." The purser tapped his fingertips together thoughtfully. "I do hate to tell you this," he said, "but your ostrich shrunk into a barnyard chicken, and we don't allow chickens in the cabins." Uncle Will was not beaten. "Does the steamboat have any rules against an ostrich?" he asked. "None at all." "Have you ever seen a bona fide rock-bottom guaranteed ostrich before?" "Never." "In that case," said Uncle Will, "how can you be sure you're not looking at one right now?" The purser pulled at his ear and squinted at Chancy and Calamity. Finally he gave a nod. "By gum, sir, you've got a point. That's true. I've been leaning on hearsay evidence. But facts is facts. Why, I'm ashamed of myself. That's an ostrich. I can see it now. Definite resemblance. I'll put the three of you in cabin 7. The boy there goes half price. I'll have to charge you for the ostrich, though, and since it's full grown, as you said yourself, sir, I'll have to charge you full fare." With hardly a pause, Uncle Will hooked his thumbs in his calico vest and turned to Chancy. "Nephew, it is everlasting expensive to travel with an ostrich. Full fare, imagine that. I didn't reckon on it, by the eternal. We'd be money ahead to let folks believe that bird is just a barnyard chick and travel deck passage with the onions." Uncle Will was still chuckling in the morning when the snapping turtle gave a blast of her whistle and began kicking up spray. He didn't mind losing the battle of nonsense with the mud clerk. He hadn't expected to win it. "Let it be a lesson to you, Chancy. Not to tell lies?" "Bless me, no," said Uncle Will, brushing flakes of onion skin off his coat. "A whopper never hurt anyone, if it's tall enough. It's pleasuring I'm talking about. You got to make your own at times. If you know you're going to sleep on onions anyway, why, you might as well sleep with a smile as a frown." Belching black smoke, the steamboat carried them down the river. It coughed and wheezed and shook. Chancy could hardly restrain his excitement. They were on their way to Paducah at last. He spent a good part of the morning exploring the boat. He stood at the open door of the engine room, breathing the smell of warm oil and watching the massive machinery at work. With bursts of steam, a huge piston slid back and forth like a battering ram. Cranks turned, rods rose and fell, and valves opened and shut. Everywhere, brass and steel shone like gold and silver. The wonders in the room held Chancy fascinated. He had never before seen anything more complicated than a water pump. This was a marvel. The only familiar thing was the spittoon at the engineer's feet. Before long, he had worked his way to the top deck and gazed at the glass box where the captain was spinning the wheel. The steamboat was stepping along at a lively pace, wriggling like a fish through the shallow channel. At the rate they were moving, Chancy thought, they ought to be catching up with the drifting raft in a matter of hours. The upper deck was hot as a skillet, and Chancy soon drove for the shade of the cargo deck. He let Calamity have some water out of the dipper and finally settled himself with Uncle Will on the sacks of onions. "Seen everything?" said Uncle Will. "Most everything." Chancy's eyes lit on a bullet hole in the woodwork. "You reckon the lead's still in there?" "It wouldn't surprise me. Would they mind if I dug it out?" "You'd be doing them a favor," said Uncle Will, handing Chancy his Barlow knife. "How much do you recall about the folks who took your sister to Paducah?" Chancy set to work. "They were named Jones, I remember that." Uncle Will pursed his lips. "They shouldn't be hard to find, with an odd, unusual name like that. Jones. Do you recollect if Mr. Jones had a first name?" "No, sir. He was a chair-bottomer just passing through. I only saw him once, and that was at night. He had a turkey neck." Uncle Will said no more, and Chancy kept burrowing with the knife. He could hardly wait to see Indiana's face when they surprised her. Any other girl might faint dead away, but not Indiana, he thought. She was too contrary to do a thing like that. By dogs, she might not even be glad to see him. Even after 4 years, she might not have forgiven him for letting that Kentucky-bound chair-bottomer take her away. But hadn't he tried? Hadn't he run away 6 times trying to follow the wagon, even after it was long gone? Of course, Indiana was grown up some now, and he told himself she'd be overjoyed at the sight of him. He wondered if she still had the corn-husk doll Mama had made for her. As he recollected, it was named Tolly. It was named Tolly, and he remembered how she had clung to it, sitting up on the wagon the night she had gone. Like a pulled tooth, the bullet came out. The bullet came squeaking out of the wood. It was a misshapen lump of lead, but Chancy admired it enormously. He held it to the light like a jewel and then bounced it in his hand, taking the heft of it. Just imagine, he thought. This bullet was shot in the war. He meant to keep it, and slipped it into his hip pocket with the buckeye. Just before noon, Captain Harp's raft loomed ahead as a dark splotch on the river. Chancy and Uncle Will jumped to their feet. The whistle began to scream as if to blast the hickory logs out of its path, but Captain Harp wasn't giving up an inch of water. Chancy climbed on the bull rail, and he and Uncle Will yelled and waved their arms. "Captain Harp! Billy Arkansas, we're here!" But their voices were drowned out by the thumping and splashing of the paddle wheels and the roar of the whistle. The steamboat edged by, passing up the raft as if it were standing still. Quickly, Chancy tried to spy out his axe. He could see chicks everywhere, but no axe. And then the raft slipped behind them, rolling in great billows over the wake. Captain Harp finally looked up to shake his fist at the steamboat. Chancy glanced at Uncle Will. He couldn't entirely hide his disappointment, but Uncle Will was undaunted. "Why, that axe was there in the doghouse waiting for you," he said, "sure as sunrise." Chancy took a breath. "I wouldn't be a bit surprised," he said, having something to hang his hopes on. Later, with long shouts of its steam whistle, the Snapping Turtle came charging around a last bend, and there was the mouth of the Tennessee Sea, and there was a town, sprawling in the heat of dust of the flat Kentucky bank. Chancy stood on the rail and watched. He didn't have to be told. He knew he was looking at Paducah. And that is the end of Chapter 10.